All right. So thank you all for tuning in. I think I might know a handful of you, but for those that don't know me, my name is Adam Rembert. I work at the Litzsinger Road Ecology Center in Ladue, and my main job is ecological restoration work, but for the past couple of years, a big side interest of mine has been studying bryophytes. And it kind of started as like a casual interest, and as it's taken up more of my time, I've gotten more and more interested in it, and now I get really excited to talk to other nature-minded folks about these things, so I do appreciate the opportunity. So I'm going to start off with the very basics, which is, single advance. There we go. So what is a moss? So first of all, they are plants, kingdom Plantae, division Bryophyta. If you've heard the word bryophyte before, that actually refers to a group of 3 different types of organisms, which are the mosses, liverworts, and hornworts. Mosses are the biggest member of that group, and they're what I'm going to be focusing on because they're the ones I'm most familiar with and I've spent the most time studying. But their division is Bryophyta, so that's where the word bryophyte comes from. But they are what's called non-vascular plants. So a lot of plants you're probably familiar with have what's called a vascular system. It's essentially this internal plumbing by which they conduct water and nutrients throughout roots, leaves. Mosses and other bryophytes don't have that. They have very, very simplified cellular structures, and they can't move water very far, which is the biggest factor that keeps them so small because they can only conduct water a tiny distance. They also don't have true roots. So traditional plant roots, they grow down into a substrate and anchor the plant in place and actually pull water and nutrients out of the soil. Mosses don't do that. They have these thin hair-like structures called rhizoids that essentially just attach them to whatever they're growing on. So they aren't really pulling much of anything out of whatever they're growing on. They're just held there in place. They get all their nutrients from the air and surface water. And they also reproduce with spores or sometimes vegetatively. So here's a simple diagram of what moss sex looks like. If there are any kids present, I won't get too into this, but essentially there's male and female parts. Fertilization occurs. Then they send up this capsule that's just like full of these tiny little spores that are very resilient. They can stay viable for a long time throughout many tough conditions. So these capsules release the spores, they float somewhere, and then they wait until conditions are favorable, and then they germinate and grow into new plants. And these are all very primitive adaptations because mosses and other bryophytes are a very primitive group of plants. They are the second most primitive plants that are still around today after our modern algae. So if you look at this simple timeline of plant evolution, down here at the bottom with this kind of primordial ancestral algae, all the way up to the earliest group, which is the flowering plants, you can see that the bryophytes break off rather early, just after these two, which are the modern algae. And they're also found on every single continent, which includes Antarctica. So it's not just a blue and white frozen wasteland. There are pockets of green. So as long as there's enough moisture, mosses can pretty much take up any space that's not occupied by other plants. So even in the very frozen south, there still is some green. And real quick, I wanted to mention a lot of things that are not moss, that are kind of colloquially called moss, but just aren't. This is a common one called reindeer moss. You might have seen this growing in and amongst other moss communities. I don't know if reindeer eat it, but I can say that it is not moss. This is actually a species of lichen. It's a cladonia. And lichens are lumped in with mosses a lot because they co-occur very frequently, but they're not plants. They're very cool organisms, very much worth looking at if you have the time, but they aren't plants. They're technically classified as fungi. Another one, if you've been down in like the swampy south, is this stuff you see growing on trees called Spanish moss, which is neither Spanish nor is it a moss. This is actually a flowering plant. It's a species of Tillandsia, the same genus as those little air plants you can find at a lot of nurseries now. So it's just an epiphytic flower. You can see the tiny little flowers up in the corner. You might have heard of these things called club mosses, sometimes spike mosses, or lycophytes. They're in the division Lycophyta. These are sort of the next evolutionary step up from mosses because they actually do have vascular tissue. So they have that internal plumbing that lets them move water around further so they can grow a lot bigger. So they look like mosses on steroids. So I'm going to be focusing on mosses for pretty much this whole talk, but I did want to mention the other members of the bryophyte triad. The second biggest group is the liverworts, the division Marchantiophyta. Just some slight morphological differences to mosses. They're slightly more primitive and they have slightly different growth patterns, but still very, very closely related. A few of the more common ones you might see are this one up top, the Marchantia, has this kind of like loby growth pattern, and when it reproduces, it has these little palm tree-like fruiting bodies. And then at the bottom, one of my favorites is Connocephalum, also called snakewort. As you can see, it has this cool reptilian pattern. You'll find a lot in on wet rocky areas, like under waterfalls. Oh, and that bottom one, I found out earlier this year, when you rub it and smell it, it smells like spicy vanilla. So bonus. Another really common one is Frulania. You've probably seen it on every other tree in the woods, but not knowing what it was. It looks like a lichen or blends in really well with the tree bark on darker tree species. But if you get up close to it, especially on wet days, you can see these like leaf-like structures that give it away as a liverwort. And the third member are the hornworts, the Anthocerophyta. These are pretty common, but there's not very many species that are known. I think worldwide there's only a little over 100 species described. We only have one in Missouri, and this is it, the Carolina hornwort. When it's in its normal growth phase, it looks like a kind of nondescript liverwort, but when it's in the reproductive phase, it has these horn-like protuberances which where the name comes from, hornwort, because of those reproductive structures. So at this point, you might be thinking to yourself, and as you're probably aware, gee, the plant kingdom just has so much beautiful diversity. You got these like big, charismatic, sexy flowers. You got these big, tall trees. You got lush foliage, like everywhere you look. So why do we care about this, right? And it's a question I get a lot. Like, why moss? What's the big deal about moss? It's just moss. And a lot of it is because we don't see mosses like this. We see them like this. We look at them from a distance. Even a lot of naturalists are used to seeing mosses like from the scale of higher plants, where they just look like this homogeneous green carpet that's everywhere. But if you actually take the time and bend down and get closer, you'll see how much diversity is actually there. So instead of seeing a homogeneous carpet of moss, you can look closer and see oh, actually there's multiple species overlapping in most spots. Mosses very rarely form a monoculture, and you'll definitely see different types of growth patterns. So in this picture, you see in the background this wispy hair-like species called Dicranum, and then poking through it, you have these larger pinnately branched stems, which is, I think that's Hypnum. I don't know. And then often it's not just two, you'll have 3 or 4 species growing on top of each other with very different growth patterns. And I don't think it's, even if you don't know their names or what they are, it's not that hard to see, oh, like this stuff up here is definitely different from this stuff down here. And you just gain a more appreciation for how much diversity is actually out there. And something I like to tell people to do is, as they're walking through an area that's very rich in mosses, if you just take like a little piece, like please don't grab like big handfuls, but you can take like a little sprig, maybe like every other clump of moss you see, and then at the end of your walk, like line them up side by side. You'll actually start seeing like what's out there, and you can actually identify them as individual plants. Like you have ones that have this kind of like worm-like growth patterns, have these tree-like growth patterns. You have the leucobryoms, which are like little succulents, the polytrichums that look like palm trees. One of my favorites to find is dicranum, which is very common and forms these nice luscious mounds with this like comb over hairdo that looks like it should be in a shampoo commercial. It's just absolutely beautiful. And then just all sorts of like leafy growth patterns, which is fine. Like mosses are very pretty and da-da-da-da. Once you start to look at them, you're like, oh, that's really nice, but why do we care? You know, what does it do? Like as like naturalists and ecologists, or even like other just a basic plant person, you're like, well, what is this doing here? Like, why is this important? And when we think about mosses' roles in the ecosystem, a lot of what we're talking about is this process called ecological succession. So I'm going to take you back to maybe high school biology or maybe like early college biology and talk about this timeline of succession, where you go from pretty much bare exposed ground, and then gradually different plant communities take over at certain steps as that area matures and eventually reaches a climax community. And of course, different kinds of disturbance will knock it back into these earlier successional communities. And if you look on this timeline, you could see lichens and mosses are very, very early steps. And mosses are what we're going to call ecological pioneers. So they're some of the first organisms to colonize completely bare or disturbed areas. You don't have to be a master gardener or even have much of a green thumb to realize that bare exposed concrete is not ideal plant habitat. But mosses do just fine. Like there's many moss species that specialize on bare rock. The spores land there, they germinate, they don't need to dig roots through concrete, they just attach and they can grow nice and happy. And then as they're growing, they'll actually start building up that first soil layer underneath them. So remember earlier I said that mosses can't conduct water very far, they can only like move water a short distance. So when an individual moss plant gets to a certain height, then it can't move water further up anymore. But if it wants to keep growing, it has to keep going up. So what happens is it'll grow upward from its meristem, and then the lower sections of the stem will start to die off. So if you look at this picture here, you'll see this thin green layer of living tissue, and then all this brown under it is essentially dead or non-functional. And then the very oldest sections of stem will eventually start to decompose and start building that first soil layer. And then also the dense growth will trap any airborne particulates or like debris. It'll hold it there in place. So instead of like blowing away somewhere, it'll hold on to those little particulates and add that to that early soil layer as well. And then they also provide excellent habitat for seeds and young germinating plants. So if a seed were to land on a bare rock surface, or even sometimes just bare soil, there's a good chance it might not survive in the long term because it's going to be very exposed. It might get washed away by wind or water. It could get dry out. It could be eaten by something. But if that seed were to land in a nice, soft, moist blanket of moss, it has these dense leaves and stems to kind of hold it in place, so it's not going to go anywhere. It has plenty of access to moisture because mosses are very good at holding water, and it has nice organic matter to send its first roots down into. So they pave the way for higher plant communities to take place and succession to continue. The few of you that have been to Litzsinger might recognize this. So this is the roof of one of our buildings. It's the cabin, and it's a wood shingle roof. The mosses there were not planted. They colonized completely on their own. The spores managed to take hold on these bare shingles and grow and form this nice lush community, which looks wonderful. And then now you see all these higher plants popping up where those seeds have found that, whereas if they just landed on the bare roof, they would have just been gone. But since they've landed in this moss layer, they're able to start growing. So this is succession in action from the start. So if we let this go for maybe like 50 to 100 years, we might have a nice woodland up on this roof, which would look great. They also create habitats within themselves. So the growth structure of mosses, you have this dense community of overlapping stems and leaves. You get lots of pockets of water and air, which make ideal insulated habitat for all sorts of microinvertebrates. So if this larger picture is this moss called Entodon. It has these leaves in kind of like overlapping layers going up the stem. And if you take a little snippet of that and put it under microscope, you'll see that along the stem, underneath the leaves, are these little pockets of water. And sometimes you'll find little things like swimming in those tiny pockets. So every little handful of mosses you find contains its own microcosm of organisms. You'll find all sorts of things, like you find little rotifers and tardigrades and nematodes and other microscopic things. And then larger things like spiders and these cute little springtails and all sorts of other invertebrates. Like I don't think I've ever pulled up a moss clump and like looked at it and not had something crawl out at me. And since they're so absorbent, they are also very good at reducing erosion and water runoff. So since they will hold on to precipitation and surface water, instead of that water running off somewhere and like furthering erosion, the mosses will actually keep that water and slowly release it, either through evaporation, or if the mosses are already saturated, they'll slowly release it into the ground. So that reduces erosion. And they're also very, very good at sequestering pollution, especially heavy metals. So remember, they get all their nutrients from the surface. So any pollutants on the surface are going to show up in these things. And a lot of studies have been done in urban areas and around things like mining reclamation sites, where these mosses have absorbed pollutants that we otherwise wouldn't really want in our surface water or air. And not only are they highly absorbent, they also have antibacterial properties, especially the more acidic loving mosses like the sphagnums. Lots of documented use by indigenous people and more modern times, like in World War I and a lot of other world wars. If you get a wound and you don't have access to bandages, you can get a nice clump of moss, slap it on there, and you'd probably be fine because the acidity helps kill off bacteria. That also gives them other domestic uses, such as diaper fillings, and down here even menstrual products, all using moss, specifically I think sphagnum. Also, they just look cool in the landscape. If you've seen scenes like this down in the Ozarks, especially this time of year in like late winter, early spring, is prime moss season, and all the other plants are dormant. and you just have these like nice green tufts like on the rocks and the trees. Just kind of makes everything look kind of like Middle Earth. Like if you have a rock garden and you're able to get moss to colonize, like you just aged your garden. Looks like you aged your garden like 100 years. And a lot of people associate mosses with this type of habitat, this like cool, like dark, moist, old growth forest type area. But they also take advantage of quite a few more ephemeral habitats, such as this. So this is one of the tall grass prairies we have at Litzsinger, and a lot of people would not look at this and say, oh, that's a good moss habitat. But if you were to walk out there into the grass and just kind of like pull it apart all the way down to the soil and reach the bottom, you'll find them there. Like every few steps. They're small and they're very easily missed, but they are there underneath the thatch layer in the prairie, growing on the soil, in between the spaces of the higher plants where they aren't outcompeted. Even when you burn it, prescribed burns are a very common and effective tool for management of grasslands. And just like higher plants, some mosses do take advantage of burns. So after a burn, you'll find plenty of quick growing mosses colonizing the burn scars. In spots like this, like along creek banks that are prone to flooding. This is the bank of Deer Creek, which runs through Litzsinger Road Ecology Center. If you aren't familiar with Deer Creek, it's a very volatile waterway, and it's lots and lots of flooding and erosion. If you look at this bottom picture, like I'm about 6'1", and you can see like how eroded this bank is over my head with all the exposed tree roots. But you'll often find like this community of mosses growing right on the mud of the bank. And it'll just keep getting bigger and bigger, and then eventually a storm comes through and then it floods, and that will scour that bank back down to bare mud, and these mosses just recolonize over and over again. And they aren't found in the woodlands. There's like 3 or 4 species that specialize in this these very ephemeral habitats like stream banks. So when we're talking about moss habitat, what we really want to focus on are these things called microhabitats. So these are small pockets within larger habitat types that have very, very they're similar conditions, but they're different enough to affect like how communities are distributed. Things that are nearly imperceptible at our scale. So it can be like you see this picture at the bottom where like this moss is growing around the base of a tree, but it's not going onto the soil. So this moss community specializes at the bottom of the tree, but not soil, around the base of the tree. And two of the main broad habitat types I work in are woodlands and prairies, and within those two, here are some of the examples of what microhabitats would be. So it could be under leaf litter where there's less light and more moisture, up on trees where it's going to be a little drier or a little more air exposure, then growing on soil versus rocks. In the prairie, it's a little more subtle, but since no ground is perfectly flat, there's going to be depressions and mounds. And at the top of those mounds, it's going to be slightly drier because water runs downhill. So it's going to be just different enough for different mosses to colonize these different areas. And it's interesting, like I mentioned, being involved in ecological restoration work and how that can affect these communities. So one of our biggest problems in the woodlands is winter creeper, Euonymus fortunei. You might be familiar with it. It's a invasive ground cover that can escape into woodlands and form these solid blankets over the forest floor that just kind of smother everything underneath of it. But some mosses can actually thrive. So if you take all these vines and just kind of pull them up, like we found like really nice, lush, beautiful moss communities growing underneath those leaves. And one of our main methods of controlling winter creeper is to come through and foliar spray, and later in the season when all the other plants are down. So we're really only targeting this species. So that is pretty good at killing all the winter creeper, and then but that exposes all of these moss communities. And we just drastically altered the microhabitat that they like when we did this, right? So it's not, so here they're growing underneath this ground cover canopy layer, so there's not very much light. It's nice and moist under there. But after we remove that, now they're exposed to full sun, and it's gonna be a lot drier, a lot harsher conditions, and a lot of these mosses just got completely sunburnt after their canopy died. So it's interesting to watch, is this gonna adapt and come back, or is this gonna be completely extirpated, and is that going to be succeeded by a different moss community, or is anything gonna come back there at all? So as far as trying to learn these things, here's a quote by A.J. Grout, biologist in the early 1900s. Many years of study of mosses in the field have convinced the author that any person of average intelligence can easily learn to recognize 75 to 100 common mosses with just a hand lens, and then twice that with a microscope. So this could either be encouraging or insulting, depending on who you are. I mean, I don't think I know 100 mosses off the top of my head. So apparently I have some work to do, according to Mr. Grout. And it's very hard, even for a lot of seasoned naturalists and botanists. Like Moss ID has can have a pretty deep learning curve because it's very different from learning to identify flowers or trees. So the first challenge is they're small. A lot of the key features, you'll need at least a hand lens. Sometimes you really do need to get in there with a microscope to see it. Not a lot of common names, which a lot of people kind of scoff at common names, but they do have their place. Like if you're walking, if like I'm trying to show someone like a cool moss, and I was like, oh, hey, look, that's a nice patch of brachythecium. Like, they're probably not going to care. But if I say, oh, this is called broom moss, or oh, this is called feather moss, like that's a name that most people can remember, and then they can maybe one day work their way up to Latin. But they are often overlooked by many naturalists, which goes into why they haven't been named very well. And for amateurs, or just hobbyists, there's not a lot of good resources out there. There's all kinds of field guides for wildflowers and trees and birds and all that, but it's much, much harder to find a useful field guide for bryophytes. So here's a much more encouraging quote from Robin Wall Kimmerer. Knowing mosses does not require knowing the scientific names. What's more important is recognizing them and acknowledging their individuality. So that's really what I try to do, is just to get people to take the time, look at these things, and recognize that it's not just moss. Like, there's all sorts of different species that take advantage of all sorts of different habitats, and really gaining a better appreciation for how much diversity is in the world around us. But I will turn you all into amateur biologists really quick. And teach you what to look for. And we'll go over a few common species. So one of the biggest features to look at is the growth type. So there's two broad growth types when looking at mosses, the acrocarps and the pleurocarps. The acrocarps, if you think acro means like refers to height or upwardness. So acrocarps, they grow in these densely clumped stems that all grow upward, and they form these nice mounds, which pleurocarps, the stems grow sideways, kind of creeping along the ground. It's in like these loose mats. Very easy to tell them apart if you don't even need a hand lens. You can usually just like kind of like touch it or just like get close to it and see which one it is. Ideally, you'd want a you'd want to see these things. Just like it's easier to identify a flower when it's actually flowering. It's easier to identify a moss when it's in its reproductive stage, called the sporophyte stage. It can be very, very telling for a lot of species what these look like. You know, are they on long stalks, or are they like really short or right up against the bottom of the plant? Do the capsules knot over, or do they point upright? Are they this kind of oval shape, or are they like this little balloon shape up here in the corner? And then seeing like the different parts of these things. So as these things are growing, they have this covering called a calyptera. And then as the capsule matures, that pops off. And then it has this little hat on top called the operculum, which covers the opening. And then when they're ready to release their spores, that little hat pops off and reveals this mouth called the peristome, which you usually need a microscope to see, but it's ringed by these teeth. So it looks like this cool like xenomorph mouth, right? This is a scanning electron microscope picture, but it was too cool not to throw in here, so I did. But essentially these teeth, they surround the opening and keep all those spores from like falling out all at once. So if you think of when you seed, like when you're spreading wildflower seed, or if you're seeding a lawn, you don't want to just dump handfuls of grass seed out. You want to just like gently like shake it and like make sure they spread out. This is the same principle. It has those teeth to keep those spores in, and then they gradually release like a salt shaker. And there's all sorts of different patterns that these can take. If you are lucky enough to like get a good enough microscope to see these things, you'll see all sorts of cool designs and shapes that all look very alien. These funarias with this cool spiral design. A lot of them just have like this singular or a double row of teeth that look like mouths. Tortula is a cool one. It has this like these like really long peristome teeth that are all twisted together like spaghetti on a fork. So very cool if you take the time to look at them. And just like higher plants, there's lots of differences in leaf shape. So some have like rounded leaves, some have these long, thinner leaves, or ones that look like sickles. Some have these little points at the end, or maybe like a shorter point. Looking at the margins, are they smooth or are they like toothy? And this structure in the center of the leaf called a midrib, that's often a key feature. You know, like if you take the time to slog through a moss key, they'll ask, you know, does the midrib go halfway, or does it go all the way to the tip, or does it go past the tip? Some of the more fun ones, they'll actually, you have to actually count the number of cells between the end of the midrib and the tip of the leaf. And it's like, is it 5 to 7 cells down, or is it 8 to 10 cells down? And a lot of times to confirm a species ID, you really have to peel off a leaf or take a cross section and put it under a microscope and look at the cellular structure. They'll say, is it this ovular pattern? Is it more squared? How thick are the cell walls between the leaf? If it has these stacks of cells, you have to take a cross section, count or see what the stacks look like, and count them up. There's these specialized cells at the base of the leaf called alar cells. Are those present? What do they look like? So this is a lot of the times why I don't bother trying to ID the species unless I have access to a microscope and a lot of time. Usually just doing down to the genus level is fine. A lot of field guides will get you to the genus level. But if you have a microscope and some time and like a good like X-Acto knife to like take sections, it's cool to look at. So if we were doing this in person, I'd have pop quiz time, but since I can't do that, I'll just go tell you how many moss species are in Missouri. So right now, the latest literature says we have 323 species of mosses that are recorded in the state. That was back in 2015. In greater North America, north of Mexico, there's a little over 2,800. And then worldwide, it's, depending on what source you use, it's between 9,000 and over 14,000 species. It's kind of up in the air because there's not a lot of people looking at these things, so we really don't know how much diversity is actually out there. But I will, oh, okay. And if we look at this map of moss species by county in Missouri, from John Atwood at the Missouri Botanical Garden, you can see like what the distribution looks like. And if you'll notice that the average number of species is much, much higher in the southern half of the state versus the northern half, because that's the Ozarks, right? So there's a lot more variation in habitat. So there's a lot more microhabitat conditions. So there's a lot more room for specialization versus up here where the plains, it's a lot of plains and farmlands. Except this little, I'm not sure what county that is, that has 127 up in the north there. I don't know what's going on there, but must be something cool. Everything else around is much lower. So just going over some of the more common species in Missouri. This is one I mentioned earlier. This is Dicranum, commonly called broom moss. There's a few different species, but they all have these like nice big clumps, usually on soil, and have these like wispy hair-like leaves that are usually combed over to one side. Sometimes they're a little more unkempt. And one that looks like it is called apple pear moss, the Bartramia palmiformis. But this one has very distinct spore capsules that are perfectly round, like little apples. Stratodon. So this one is very, even as far as mosses go, this is pretty nondescript until it is in the sporophyte stage, and it just has this dense miniature thicket of these bright red stems and these capsules that point over, so that makes it a lot easier to identify. But the base of leaves has this like kind of pointy rosette. Physidens, this one's very common in wet areas with a very distinctive shape of these two rows of overlapping leaves that form this like fan-like pattern. Atricum is one that's common on disturbed soil like trail sides, and I often see it on overturned tree roots. Just kind of like pretty close to the ground, like this kind of like almost like pollen tree or bromeliad-like growth pattern to it. One of my favorites is called Polytrichum, which looks a lot like the Atricum, but much, much bigger. These are pretty common in the state. I see them a lot on like rocky like woodlands and glades down in the Ozarks. They're very, very showy, very charismatic, and probably the biggest moss species we have. So a lot of people think mosses are small, but these things can get very, very large. This is a very large mound that I accidentally stepped in, and then my foot went like down like a foot deep into it. So I had to pull up a sprig and take a picture because this is like the biggest one I've ever found. So you can see how long this thing it's probably like 20 something years old. But also remember that I mentioned mosses can't move water very far, so the living tissue isn't very big. So this few inches of green part is the only actively growing part of the plant. The rest of this is non-functional or pretty much dead stems, and here's where it attached to the bottom. Plagionium, baby tooth moss, is pretty, as far as mosses go, this can be like a really weedy species, and this is one that's very easy to identify because it looks very leafy. It looks like you took like a viney houseplant and just shrunk it down. Called baby tooth moss because if you take one of those leaves and put it and like look at it in it, you can probably see where the hand lands, but there's these tiny row of teeth going along the outside edge of the leaf. Leucodon can be easy to identify. It's called hook moss because when it's dry, you can see it has this upward hooking growth shape. And this one also occurs higher up on the bark of trees. So like it can be like up to chest height or like up into the canopy of trees. So it tolerates a lot more exposure than other moss species. But yeah, when it's dry, it has this hook shape. And then when it gets wet, it actually spreads out like there on the right. I actually have a video of it happening in action. So this is a dried sample of hook moss that I put under a microscope and squirted some water on it. This video is sped up, I think, 3 times.
That is so cool.
Yeah, if you see this on a tree and you have a water bottle, just go and it looks dry, just go ahead and squirt it and watch that happen because it is pretty cool. So another good one is orthotrichums. This is another one that occurs higher up on trees or out on the branches. It occurs in these like very small, tight tufts, and they're like these really compact rosettes with these capsules that are just like right on top, so they don't have these long stalks. There's these like tight little clumps like in between cracks in tree bark. Wycia or pigtail moss. This is one you'll see. This is one that colonizes disturbed areas like the creek bank. Easy to identify when it's wet or dry. So when it's wet, it has this kind of like spread out bromeliad-like growth pattern, and it's usually a bright green. And then when it dries, the leaves curl up really thin and tight like pigtails. Also easy to identify when it's in the reproductive phase because it has these like nice round balloon-like sporophytes. And this one is actually an annual. So this one will reproduce, throw its spores, and those plants will die. So it needs to reproduce every year to keep occurring. So Detrichum, golden thread moss, another one that's pretty nondescript until it reproduces. Then it's like this mass of like very fine hair that's like this bright golden green color. I think another name is cow hair moss. But this is very common in like rocky, glady areas as well. Bryum is like a really large genus of mosses, but they're very common. They're like the quintessential sidewalk moss. So if you have cracks in the sidewalk or in your driveway and there's moss growing in it, 9 times out of 10 it's going to be this species, Bryum argenteum, or a different one. This one is silver moss because the leaf tips are clear. They don't have any chlorophyll, so they have this kind of like whitish, silverish color when the light hits them. Climastium is one that's somewhat restricted to higher quality areas in like wet low spots like shut-ins and along like ravines. But it's very, very easy to tell because it's pretty big and it has this distinct tree-like growth habit. So each little stem looks like a tiny little tree. Fern moss thwidium, so called because it looks like tiny ferns. This one tolerates like more upland, dry, rocky spots down in the Ozarks. And it's usually this kind of golden green color. Leucobryum you'll see throughout like pretty much any woodland. It's like these densely packed like whitish green clumps, and if you look at them closely, they look like little like succulents. And we don't really have sphagnums around here, but they look cool and they're really they have a lot of cool functions in the ecosystem, so I wanted to put them on here just to show you like what they look like. These are restricted to bogs. If you've ever used peat moss in your potting mix, this is what peat moss is. This is sphagnum moss. It's also one of the ones commonly used as bandages and diapers and all that. Okay, so some helpful resources for those that do want to dive into this. These are all online resources, some websites that I have found helpful. I won't go through all of these, but Ohio Moss and Lichen Association, based out of Ohio, obviously, but their website has a pictorial guide for a lot of common species that are found also in Missouri. Illinois Wildflowers, really good website, also has a little section on mosses. Northern Forest Atlas is more focused on the boreal regions, like upper Michigan and like into Canada. But that's the website where I got a lot of these pictures from. They just put out a really, really pretty field guide in print, but they also do have a good pictorial guide on their website. Some good books and field guides. Common Mosses of the Northeastern Appalachians is probably the best field guide I've had. It's pretty cheap, pretty easily available. So if you're going to get a field guide, that's the one I would recommend. Other ones, like the next couple down, are good. Mosses and Other Bryophytes, an illustrated glossary. That's really useful for like IDing the specific structures of mosses that you might see. One book I do recommend to people is Gathering Moss, A Natural and Cultural History of Mosses by Robin Wall Kimmerer. If this book does not make you appreciate mosses, like nothing will. So Robin Wall Kimmerer, if any of you have read Braiding Sweetgrass, she's the same author. She's an Indigenous American ecologist whose specialty is bryophytes, so she is an actual moss expert and just a beautiful writer. I got the audiobook to this and binge listened to it while driving to Chicago, and it is absolutely phenomenal. And then Flora of North America and How to Know the Mosses in Liverworth, those are actually botanical keys. If you really, really want to get into it, I would suggest playing around with botanical keys. But I will say that after trying to key out mosses with these scientific keys, I will never complain about having to key out any other plant. Because mosses are very, very tricky to key out, and there's very few keys out there to use. And then this one at the bottom, Walk Softly Upon the Earth, Pictorial Field Guide to Missouri Mosses, is the only specific field guide to Missouri there is, published in 1985 by MDC. I put an asterisk by it because it's not actually very good. There's quite a few errors in it and the pictures aren't great, but I just figured I'd mention it because it's Missouri's only field guide, I guess. But it's also like hard to get because I think it's out of print, so you're better off with one of the top ones. If any of you are on the app iNaturalist, my colleague James Fappel, who's much better with this app than I am, helped me make this project within iNaturalist, Moss Missouri. So any moss observation that's tagged in Missouri and uploaded to iNaturalist will show up on here. So if you have pictures of mosses taking up space on your phone, just go ahead and upload them. And I do try to get on there when I can and help ID stuff. Some of them, unfortunately, are not very good, or they're taken from too far away and you can't see the structures. And it's like, well, I can tell you it's a moss, but I don't really know much more than that. So this is, I think this screenshot was taken last year, but you can see there's 14 species. We have 323 species in Missouri. So come on, we need to get on this. And this wouldn't be possible without lots and lots of help from people who are much more knowledgeable than I am. So I just wanted to give a few shout outs here. First of all, Nels Holmberg, who's another master naturalist, great guy, very knowledgeable about mosses. I've gotten to work with him a few times and take a trip with him. John Atwood and Bruce Allen are both actual like professional bryologists at the Botanical Garden who Nels introduced me to. And they were very generous with their knowledge and very patient with my questions. So thank you to those two. And with that, I will answer any questions you have.
First of all, Adam, thank you so much. What an
Well,
in-depth
yeah.
presentation. Real quick here. My goodness sakes. Let me make sure everybody's unmuted here. I think everybody is. I see people. Well, I've got a few questions. First of all, the first one I came up to with this group was, are there invasive mosses?
Good question.
That's a good question. We aren't since there's so little understanding about moss ecology right now, and like we're really not sure like what's going on. Like is this we're not in a place where we can say like, oh, this is a native moss or this is an invasive moss. And also, since they've been around for such a long time and they are older than most of our continents, you know, it's quite possible that the mosses that are here have always been here, since they've had enough time to show up here at this point. So that's a good question. Maybe in like 50 years, when there are more professional biologists, after mosses get really, really popular somehow, we'll know more. But right now, yeah, not sure. There are some that are more weedy than others, and some that are specialists.
Right.
But yeah, other than that, right now I wouldn't call any invasive.
And corollary to that was I also put in other endangered ones, and I think almost everything's probably endangered at some point or another with the amount of agriculture and other things we've done to the landscape. I mean, I'm guessing any of this, just like our natural grasses and such, so much of it is gone from what we probably had 200, 300, 400 years ago. I take it that same impact happens to all the crummy things we're doing to our natural world, probably impacting mosses to a great deal too. Are they more susceptible, or generally more susceptible to the pollutions we put out there, or are they pretty resilient to it?
So they are more susceptible to habitat degradation because they are so closely tied to their specific microhabitat conditions. So and it's very, very hard to get mosses to grow in a specific spot on purpose. It's like essentially once you've removed their microhabitat, like they're probably not gonna come back. So since we've transformed so much of the land, we've definitely lost a lot of our moss communities, and there are quite a few species that are listed as species of conservation concern or that are state endangered. But that could be because we don't know very much about them. We haven't tried looking for them elsewhere. There's just not enough eyes on the ground like looking at these things, or they might be actually threatened. But because like higher plants, some of them you can like protect their habitat, and then sometimes you can like propagate them and outplant them and do restoration work. But cultivating mosses is much, much harder, and especially if you don't have the right microhabitat conditions. And if we don't know what those were before that species got extirpated, then there's very, very little hope that it'll come back, unfortunately.
I'll pause there for a second, but I got more questions.
Well, I have a question real quick. In your pictures, you showed us a picture of the alor cells on some of the mosses. I hope I'm saying that word right. What's the function of those cells?
Good question. So Yeah, let me just go back to it real quick. Freeze. So,
They are.
question about the alar cells, and this picture, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but in this
Yeah.
picture here, it's this swollen cell at the bottom, at the base of the leaf. And basically you can see it's much, much larger than the other cells around it. So basically that cell, when the moss gets wet, it expands, and that causes the leaf to bend outward from the stem.
Wow.
So that function is what causes this.
Oh, uh-huh.
So when this gets wet, the alar cells expand and then cause those leaves to spread outward.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Very cool.
I have a question about the photosynthesis. Some of them were like practically buried. How do they get enough sunlight to, I'm assuming they're green color, or the chloroplasts in them,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
So they don't require much sun in order to be green?
No, there are some mosses that grow in full sun, but a lot of them are much more adapted to shade, and that's more of a side effect of them like not being able to retain a lot of water and being very sensitive to moisture loss. So there's not a lot that can take being in full sun and risk getting dried out. So they do adapt well to very low light levels. And then ones there's only, like I mentioned before, like they can only have like so much like actively growing tissue. So there's a good portion of those plants you see are going to be dead anyway. It's just like the very, very top portion that's actually living and photosynthesizing.
I did get a kick too. One of your pictures there showed I don't know if everybody picked up on that, but since so much of this is done, microscopically, one of those photos there had a scale of it of 0.5 millimeters. If you could get to that one again, because it was, when you realize the scale that you're looking at here, sometimes you'll understand why it might be a little difficult to recognize this stuff.
Yeah.
Well, I have another question too, and this is just on looking at the term wort. So liverwort and St. John's wort or whatever. And I think I've always heard that the term wart referred to medicinal purposes of the plant. Is that accurate or not accurate?
So like the epithet wart, W-O-R-T, is the Anglo-Saxon term for plant. And
Okay.
way back in the day, they assumed that like everything like had a purpose to serve man. So like almost every plant had like some sort of medicinal purpose. And a lot of times it was linked to just how it looked. Like, I guess someone saw a liverwort and says, that looks like a liver. Obviously it's good for the liver in some way. So when you see like the word wart, it just means it's just an old word for plant.
Okay.
Like liver plant, horn plant,
Mm-hmm.
St. John's plant, I guess.
Yeah. Good. Thank you.
Adam, could you go over the growth types again, the acrocarp and the pleurocarp? Oh, there we go. Okay.
So,
Thank you.
Yep. So I mean, if you think like acro refers to like height, like you think acrobat, so growing upward, versus I guess pleuro means flat, I guess. So basically does it, do the stems grow like in like neat clumps of like pointing up, or do they just kind of like creep along the ground flat?
Thank you.
Yep.
Other questions here?
Hey, Adam, I gotta ask this because my grandkids and the fourth grade students that I teach will probably ask this. I was really impressed with how archaic these life forms are. I didn't realize They are just above the algae and have been on this planet forever. I mean, they've been through hell and high water, and they've survived everything that this planet has thrown at it. I mean, the resourcefulness and the tenacity of these things is just mind-boggling. So why will a rolling stone gather a moss?
It's not a real question.
I have not found any studies that have shown that moving stones do not, in fact, gather moss.
Fake news, okay.
I mean, it might actually. I'm going to take this question seriously, Bob. So if a stone is moving, it's probably picking up moss spores. So eventually that stone's going to stop, and when it does, it's going to have moss on it. They will find a way.
We're
But
going to have
maybe,
to.
but maybe when the moss is growing on the rock and the rock is rolling on that hard ground is sort of scraping off the moss.
Yeah.
Wow, Bob Dylan's going to have to rewrite his song now. Wow.
I bet that question's going to keep us up tonight.
And Bob, those mosses too, they work in a different time scale than us. So there's no stone that's rolling that long. There's like a little cartoon strip that I can't remember if Adam's the one that showed it to me or if I saw it online, but it's got lichen and moss growing on these rocks, and it says, you know, they're battling it out, and it just keeps on a time scale. They keep on getting closer, like they're each section of the is like 50 years or something like that, you know, and they're still just getting closer and closer.
Cool.
Well, so that's a great, when you were talking about the old growth like this, a lot of these simpler forms like this have been around, and I'm trying to remember the one, it's in Europe or something that's considered the oldest plant growth ever, and it's like 20,000 years old or something like that, these things that continue to grow over and over again. Is moss like that, where there's maybe blankets of it that have been around forever and just continue to grow within that community?
Very, very possibly. Like the polytrichum I showed, like this one, like that's probably between 20 and 30 years old. So it's very possible these things just persist. At a certain point, though, it's going to get, like something like this will get too big, and then it'll eventually be broken up by some kind of disturbance or some goof stepping off the trail and sinking his foot in there. But some of like the smaller, like slower growing ones, like it's quite possible that they have persisted just as long as any other organism there has.
Well, now you're going to make me petrified when I'm walking around when you said you stepped over on that and went down a foot.
Yeah,
How fast do they grow? How do you know that's like 30 years old?
I couldn't, that was just an estimate, just based on other ones I've seen. Cause like most polytrichums, like were like, I've seen like maybe like 4 to 5 inches tall. And those are in like, this was in not a very accessible area. It's like not a very trafficked spot in Southern Illinois. So it's obviously been undisturbed for a long period of time, but they do generally grow very slowly, except the more ephemeral, like fast growing or annual ones that just have to colonize super quick. Whereas things like this are restricted to more high quality habitats that might have fewer disturbance and can sort of take their time.
I was recently out of down Robinson, and you see a lot of mosses growing on rock out there, and it's kind of fascinating to see it when it's wet and it's plush, it's big, and then wintertime you'll go out there and it looks like it's all but dead and should be swept away. I take it a lot of these things will, and you were kind of showing that earlier, kind of go dormant, but water hits them again and they grow up again.
Yeah, these things are very, very tough. There's even like herbarium specimens that are like decades old. Like they're all dried out in packets. You put water on them, they'll spring right back to life. The chlorophyll might have degraded by then because like the chlorophyll, the green pigment doesn't have that long of of a life, like in an herbarium, but yeah, they'll expand right back up when if you rehydrate them. Most
I
of the time.
love these superpowers. These are amazing. Are there, where do they lie in the food chain? Are they the primary food source for any critter?
I'm not sure if anything really eats moss. Some people might, I guess, for some reason, if they need to. Maybe some like browsers can try to eat them, but they're not. First of all, like they're not very nutritious. They have very, very little nutritional value in them, and plus like they have a very high concentration or a very high ratio of cellulose, so they're like really hard and like crunchy. I would equate it to like eating like uncooked kale or collard greens. Like you can do it. Well, I guess no, because kale's like a superfood or whatever, so it has nutrition. So,
But you
yeah,
did
like,
show us,
really like tough and
show us
chewy,
a
not very
picture
nutritious,
of,
not really worth anything eating it.
you did show us a picture of a number of very small insects and other animals feeding on some moss. And you mentioned that you can't pick up a piece of moss without finding a lot of little animals in it. So I imagine that probably other things prey on those small insects and whatnot. And so it probably is the base of some food chains, wouldn't you think?
So like a lot of those like tiny critters aren't usually feeding on the mosses. Like the mosses are more the habitat. They're feeding on like any little like particulates that have like found their way into those little water pockets.
Okay.
There are some species of snails that people used to think were eating mosses, but they were actually like scraping algae that were growing on the surface of the moss leaves.
Awesome. Thank you.
Crazy. All right, if there's no more questions, my goodness. Every time we have a presentation, I go, this is the best we've had yet. But the level of questions on this one is really amazing. So any last question for any? I didn't want to cut anybody off, but anybody got one last one there? Otherwise, we'll let Adam get back to his meal or evening. Or our standard is always, you're very welcome to stay for the rest of the business meeting if you like. But if you've got a favorite TV program or dinner you haven't gotten to yet, feel free.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Adam.
Yeah.
I can send that list of like books and websites to you to send out to your members if you want.
Absolutely.
That would be great.
Okay.
And for anybody else, we did record this, so we'll have it put up on our Google Drive.